Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, I thought I'd show you guys the current 2022 Senate map with the polls if you adjust the polls for their error in 2020. What does this mean? Basically, it's if you take the 2022 polls and apply the same polling miss in 2020. So let's say in state X, Biden was up by 7% and he ended up winning it by 2%. That is a 5% margin of underestimation for Donald Trump. So if the Democrats are up by 4% in that Senate race, you give that 5% to the Republican, they'd actually be up by a point once you add that adjustment. Now, again, this isn't me saying that the polls are going to be as wrong as they were in 2020. I actually think that they're going to be, not particularly good, but I don't think they'll be as bad as they were in 2020. But this also is not my prediction. So just to put all of that out there, let's get into it here. Again, I've already filled out some of the Senate seats because these aren't really interesting. And, there are some wonky polls out of like Indiana and, Oklahoma, but they're not really worth talking about because I don't really think anyone's really interested in those races. So these are the 12 races that have interesting polls or that are competitive to some degree. Again, a state like Georgia or Pennsylvania would be like not pure dust, but like, it would be very competitive, or a state like Washington or Utah would not be as competitive. But that being said, these are the states that have like a good amount of polling, and I thought I'd just, look at them. So let's start with the state of Washington because it's, the first on our map here. So the current Washington polling average shows Patty Murray up by 10.5%. In 2020, Joe Biden was ahead in Washington on election day by 23. He ended up winning Washington by about, that's 19.2. So, yeah, the polls in Washington overshot the Democrats by about 3.8%. And if you subtract that from Murray's margin, it would be, around a 7% margin of victory for her. So it actually wouldn't be particularly good. It wouldn't really be, any, like that result would not actually be that impressive performance. She'd still win, but it wouldn't really be good. But you have to remember that like the only polls that have done this are Republican polls because the Democrats don't really care and the Republicans just want to see if it's competitive. And if, like, as the saying goes, if Trafalgar can't find the Republicans a lead, they're probably not ahead. So, Washington likely deep. Nevada, this one's interesting because historically the polls have overestimated the Republicans in Nevada. But if you look at the 2020 polls in Nevada, it gets a bit more complicated. So if I can find it here on my thing, 2022 Nevada, Cortez Masto was up by 2.9. In 2020, Biden was up in Nevada on election day by 5.3. He ended up winning it by 2.4. So that is a 2.9% margin of overestimation for the Democrats, and it's actually the exact margin Cortez Masto leads by. So it's essentially it's basically just a coin flip here, but I'll give it to Cortez Masto because again, a lot of the polls in Nevada have been like from like bad Republican internals like Trafalgar, which again had Trump winning Nevada in 2020. We haven't really had any Democratic internals here other than this poll. But again, it's also worth noting that Fabrizio, which is a Republican poll, has showed Cortez Masto up by 1 and 4. So I'm gonna stick with my coin flip Cortez Masto here. But again, statistical tie. Let's go to Utah now, where the polls are actually showing a kind of tight race, not super tight, but kind of tight. Evan McMullin trailing by 8.2%. He's the independent. He's a former Republican, but he'd probably be a bit more of a moderate voice in the Senate than Mike Lee. And if you take a look at the 2020 polls in Utah, Trump was only up by 9.8, despite the fact he ended up winning it by 20.5. So that again is like nearly an 11-point polling miss. And if you give that to Lee, he'd be up by almost the same amount as Trump. So again, Utah polls show it close, but in reality, that's probably not what's actually happening. Let's go to Arizona now, where Blake Masters trails Mark Kelly by 7.3%, which is actually a lot. And if you look at the 2020 polling error in Arizona, it's still nowhere near enough to give Blake Masters the lead. Biden was up by 2.6. He ended up winning it by 0.3. So you give that 2.3 to Blake Masters, he's down by 5. Still nowhere near outside of that margin of error. So Nevada would be likely D. Go to Colorado, similar thing here, although in Colorado the polls actually underestimated Biden by a point. I know this for a fact because it's one of the few states where the polls actually missed in that direction. Colorado 2020, Biden was up by 12.5. He ended up winning by 13.5. And right now, Bennett's up by 8.6. He'd be up by 9.6 in that adjustment. So that would be 9.6% margin of victory for Michael Bennet. So again, right now, Democrats lead 48-45. So yeah, Wisconsin, this is an interesting one. So as of right now, the polling average in Wisconsin, I don't think they have. Oh, they do actually. Oh, they added it. That's good. Again, we got one poll from Marquette, which I think is a terrible poll because this poll literally had Ron Johnson winning the youth vote by 30 points, which is a demographic that's very Democratic. So again, very bad poll there, but either way, it's what the average says. Anyways, so Barnes up by 1.8, and this actually isn't a good enough mark. It's not really enough of a firewall for him because again, if you look at the 2020 polls, Biden was up by 8.4. And he only won Wisconsin by 0.6 on election day. So, again, that's a 7.8% polling miss. Really bad polls in Wisconsin. If you apply that to Ron Johnson, he would be up by around 6%, just be likely are. So, again, nowhere near, like, Barnes have to build up a really big lead to overcome a 2020 style polling miss. For what it's worth, I think the polls are going to miss by a bit less this time. But again, just to put it out there. Ohio now. Ohio is interesting too. This is a state where Democrats have been gaining a little bit. Tim Ryan, the Democrat, leading J.D. Vance by 2.5. But again, if you look at the 2020 polls, they were not good. Trump was up by 0.8. He ended up winning Ohio by 8.1. That's a 7.3% miss. If you apply that to the 2020 polls, that would still be around a 4.8% margin of victory for Tim Ryan, or for J.D. Vance. So he would be down. You see, he'd still win, but it would be not too great of a showing. So it's actually interesting. Again, I don't really think that Tim Ryan is going to win or really come particularly close to winning, but if he can hold J.D. Vance under 7 or even under 5, that would be really impressive. Now, going over, next state here we'll do is Florida. Florida polls have been pretty bad in the past as well. Again, right now, Marco Rubio leads Val Demings by 4.1. In the 2020 polls, they were also showing a better Democratic support than what actually happened. Biden was up by 2.5. He lost by 3.3. That is a 5.8% polling error. You apply that to Rubio, he'd be up by almost 10%. That would be fairly substantial. Georgia now. Let's do Georgia because Georgia's another hotly contested seat. Right now, Raphael Warnock leads Herschel Walker by 2.6%. You apply a 2020-style polling miss to Georgia. Biden was up by 1.2. He ended up winning by about 0.23, but rounds down to 0.2. That's only a 1-point error, and it would not be enough to give Herschel Walker the lead. He'd still be down by around a 1.5. North Carolina. Polls in North Carolina have been showing a fairly tight race there. Right now, Sherry Beasley is actually in the driver's seat. According to the poll, she's up by 0.4. But again, if you apply 2020 polling miss to the 2022 Senate race, Ted Budd would retake the lead. Because if you take a look, North Carolina polls, Biden was up by 1.8. He ended up losing North Carolina by 1.3. That is a 3.1% margin of error in North Carolina. You apply that to Ted Budd, he'd be up by 2.7, which I actually think on the side is actually a pretty good guess for where the race is as of right now. I think Bud's going to win by around 2.5, maybe 3%. So that kind of corroborates my guess for the state. Now let's go to Pennsylvania, where if you take a look at the polls here, whoops, I scrolled too far. John Fetterman is leading Dr. Oz by 9.4%. And if you take a look at the 2020 polls in Pennsylvania, they weren't particularly good, but they weren't off by enough to say Dr. Oz would be ahead. Biden was up by 4.7. He ended up winning by 1.2. That is a 3.5% polling error. You give that number to Dr. Oz, he would still be down by almost 6%, which is nowhere near when he needs to be. He'd be down by a lot. Now, New Hampshire is our final state. We actually don't have a polling average there just yet. Unfortunately, they'll probably add one very soon as we get more polls. But again, Bolduc got the nomination. Smith and Morse don't really matter anymore. Hassan leads by 4 in this poll, by 9 in this poll, by 1 in this poll, by 15 in this poll, by 6 in that poll. I'm not going to add all those together. But again, the polling miss in New Hampshire from 2020 was, I think, around 4%, if I recall correctly. Yeah, Biden was up by 11. He ended up winning by 7.3. So again, you give that shift. I'm just going to assume it's somewhere around a 4 or 5% margin of victory for Maggie Hassan. So a little closer than expected, but she'd still be ahead. So where does that put us? Well, it's actually kind of close to my current projection. I think Democrats will do a little better in Washington, a little better in Wisconsin, a little better in maybe not Florida, maybe like a little better in Iowa or Missouri, or some random red states than expected. I think the Republicans will do a little better in Arizona, a little better in Pennsylvania, a little better in Ohio. But yeah, that would still be this is like a pretty realistic Senate map. Again, like I said, I don't think Ron John would win by as much as the map thinks he would. I don't think Kelly would win by as much as the map thinks he would. I think Fetterman will win by a little less. I think Patty Murray is going to win by a lot more than 7 points, probably double that in all honesty. But this is what the polls, if you apply 2020 style polling miss, would show. This is not my actual prediction. The margin's not my actual margins, but I just thought I'd show you guys because there's been a lot of talk about it. So if you enjoyed, thank you so much for watching this video. Please leave a like down below. Again, it takes me 10 minutes, 15 minutes actually to edit this video and put it out for you guys. So a like would really be appreciated. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.